Thank you for coming this evening. I'm Chip Simone, and it was my privilege to curate this exhibition. Okay, how's this? But then you can't see my face. Anyway, I'm going to introduce Bill Boling in just a moment, but I wanted to tell you first how we came to dedicate the show to Paul Kwilecki. When I was asked at the beginning of this year to take on this project, which was somewhat daunting simply because I had never done anything quite like it before, and to my knowledge, nothing quite like it had ever been done before. So this is really the first of what I hope will be a continuation of exhibitions that reflect the work being done across the state of Georgia, which is the largest state east of the Mississippi. There are a lot of people here and there are a lot of artists here. So at the very beginning, when I wanted to sort of develop some strategy as to how to go about this, I looked at the map of Georgia, a map of Georgia, and sort of studying it and trying to remember who I knew and where they were located and who I might know in some places that might know other people that I should consider. And I looked down in the lower left-hand corner of the state, and there was Bainbridge, Georgia. And I said, Paul Kwilecki, that lovely man that I got to know somewhat toward the end of his life. And I remember enjoying his company. Usually it was at Lucinda Bunnan's house. But we would have these conversations. He was a soft-spoken, gentle, lovely man, but very passionate about photography. And so I did a little research, and I looked up his work again, and I realized how wonderful it is and how important it is for the state in general, but most importantly, he did it for the love of it. You know, Alfred Stieglitz, the great American photographer and gallerist who sort of introduced modern art to America in many ways, preferred to be called an amateur to a professional, because he said amateur comes from the Italian word amore, for love, done for love. And Paul was that kind of amateur. He lived down in a remote part of this state, where most people, myself included, have never really ventured. And from what I read, and he was a very good writer, he made a decision to photograph one place, that one place where he was born and raised and where his family had been. And it took a kind of dedication and a belief in the power of photography to accomplish something significant. And I said to myself, that's the kind of person I'm looking for this exhibition. I want him to symbolize the kind of work that I want to have in this show. So I said to the MoCA people, I would like to dedicate the show and the spirit of the show to Paul Kwilecki. So for that simple reason, here we have tonight a small exhibition, a wonderful clip, a video clip. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you. It's only 4 minutes out of a much longer film that Bill and his son have been working on for a while. But it's just wonderful. His work is wonderful. He was a wonderful fella, and most importantly, he loved photography, and that's what this show is for people who love making photographs. So that's why we're here tonight, and with that in mind, most of you, is there anyone that doesn't know who Bill Boling is and all of the things that he does? So let me just get Bill up here to give the talk, but Bill and Paul were good friends. Many of these prints are from Bill's private collection, and we're very grateful to him for having lent them to the exhibition. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, with great pleasure, Bill Boling.
Thank you, Chip. Thank you very much. It's such a great honor for me to be here to speak about a photographer and a man that meant so much to me. And I say that even though Paul and I probably weren't together more than 8 or 10 times, because he wasn't leaving Bainbridge, and Bainbridge is a long way from Rome, Georgia, where I lived when I first met him. I would say, sometimes you say, well, we're honoring Paul, but that's not the case, because Paul needs no one to honor him. The work that he did across almost half a century really honors us. It honors human beings. It honors the human condition. It honors the things that are the best and the worst of all of us. And Paul, I'll say some pretty seriously I'll say some things about Paul that will make you think I'm exaggerating, but I'm not exaggerating. The things that I say are absolutely true about Paul, about his genius, about the importance of the work that he did. So I am honored to be able to say a few words about my friend Paul, and we are honored to have his daughter Elizabeth Whaley and her family and her friends up to be with us, and I hope you'll have a chance to say hello to them when we adjourn from this talk in a little bit. They came all the way up from Bainbridge, and it's quite a haul. And I'm so glad that they're here. I guess we can go maybe with lights off. So can we do that so that we can see the some of the pictures? The way to really see Paul's photographs is really to see them in the flesh, is to see his prints. I'm going to show you just some cell phone snapshots that I took from some of his books. Most of you are probably here because you know something about Paul, or you've heard a little something about Paul. It's been said that Paul is the greatest photographer that you've never heard of. And I think that's true with regard to lay people. But serious photographers all over the world know about Paul. Paul is what I call a sleeping dragon, and photographers have a lot of them that are out there. His good friend David Vestal was a sleeping dragon. He's out of the way, quietly and unassumingly building a hoard of treasures. And they're not the kind of treasures that are easily marketed. Paul wasn't interested in galleries, wasn't particularly interested in museums, although he had his fair share of attention. What he was interested in was understanding what it was about his life and his connection to the people in the community that he grew up, what that meant. What is this all about? And so I went through a number of titles for this talk, and I finally stole from Paul a little phrase where he was trying to describe what he was trying to do. And I think above any and everything else that Paul was trying to do, he was wanting to know. He was wanting to know, what are these people to me? What am I to them? What is this predicament that I've been born into, this fleshy body? I'm born into a Jewish family, I marry a Methodist girl, I fall in love, I have these kids, I'm a hardware store man, but I want to be a photographer. He had these conflicted relationships, as we all do in our families and in our community. And Paul's tool became the camera. But like Walker Evans before him, and there are a lot of parallels, and I don't mean lightweight parallels, I mean significant parallels between the great Walker Evans and the great Paul Kwilecki. And Paul steeped himself, and when I say steeped, I mean he bored down. He had not just relationships through correspondence and phone calls and visits, but he had, maybe more importantly than that, he had relationships with the great photographers, the great writers, the great thinkers, the great curators from all over the world, because he wanted to know how to make a great picture, and he wanted to understand, what is this thing that we call a photograph? How do I make a photograph that will speak the truth? How do I sidle up to a young black couple in, what do you call it, battle quarters? Is that the name of the, and have them be with me and reveal themselves to my camera. How do I muster up the courage to be able to do that when I'm clearly not from around there? So Paul, I think probably, you know, if there is a thing called destiny, that was probably Paul's destiny. I'm not sure if there, I can argue it both ways. There is such a thing as destiny, there's not, but clearly if there is a destiny, this was Paul's destiny. And at considerable personal sacrifice, he pursued his destiny as one of the world's great photographers with the same sort of quiet, dogged, patient, excellent constance that an Auger did or that a Walker Evans did. He was brilliant. So if I can make this machine work, I'll show you a few pictures that will trigger a few thoughts. So, and while I'm doing that, and apologies to Paul. Apologies. His pictures are so much better than what you're seeing here, but this will give you a rough idea. I had a similar background. I grew up in Glen Allen, Mississippi. We had a lot of the same things they have in Bainbridge in terms of economic challenges and social stratification and just backwardness and all sorts of small town, deep south stuff going on. Paul grew up in that, I grew up in that. So I immediately, when I saw his book, his first book is called Understandings. And Paul's genius was recognized fairly early on by Alex Harris and some other people. In the photography world back then, this book was published in 1981 by the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke. And they only started in 1980, so this was one of their very first projects. And Alex Harris, if you have a chance to meet him or hear him speak, he's brilliant. And the essay in this book is brilliant. There's over 100 photographs that go from the 60s through the early 60s. Paul always said that he felt he was taking pictures in the 50s. He was born in 28. Fell in love with photography when he really fell in love when he got a camera young and wanted to be a writer like Evans. But a lot of writers turn to the camera. Eudora Welty turned to the camera. But by the time that he sat down with Alex Harris and they picked 100 pictures for this book, Understandings, Paul was already a master photographer, and he had turned himself into a master photographer simply by sheer willpower and genius, and corresponding with a lot of great photographers. And Paul was not an outgoing guy. Paul was a very reserved guy. And he, in his personal life, and I didn't know him well enough. I'm going to say some things that I've read, and well, he's told me a few things, or he told me a few things. So, but I think Paul, probably at an early age, he was the one in his family that was more reserved. He would stand back a little bit, and this is true of a lot of photographers. And he would look at what other people are doing, not in a creepy way, but in a way of trying to understand. And so it was that sort of being an outsider. He was a bit of an outsider, but a loving outsider. He had a tenderness about him. His view of humanity was both tender and loving and kind, but unshirking. You'll see in a few of these pictures, he will ridicule you, mock you, satirize you, and it is because he's just looking with unblinking, unshirking, unswerving honesty. And that's kind of where his work eventually got. This photograph, I'm not sure, I think it's from the 80s. This is one that my son has, and this lets me tell you how I met Paul. I was doing the same thing in some ways Paul was. I was teaching myself photography. I was teaching myself photography through photo books and talking to people and going and learning on my own. And this photograph is not in the show, unfortunately, because it's up in New York with my son. We couldn't get it down in time. But this is such a vintage Paul photograph. This could look like a scene in a movie to me. But I think this is probably at the bus station, maybe, or some type of a public. Elizabeth, where is this picture? Do you know? Y'all know? Yeah. Bus station. And Paul had certain Paul was very methodical. As you can imagine, if you take 40 plus years to document one place, you begin to develop what your strategies are. The bus station was one of his haunts. And he had probably my guess is he knew all about that phone. He knew all about the lighting at that time of day, the cigarette machine. So any photographer would find this as a gorgeous composition, the reflection of the weight machine or I can't tell if it's a reflection or looking through to a weight machine, the fountain. And he just made the perfect document. He caught the perfect moment with someone talking, and we can project onto this image any of 1,000 things. Anything we might project onto this image would have an air of truth about it, but we'll never know who this young man's talking to. But Paul was there, and he saw him, and he knew that picture was a good one. And then Paul would go into his dark room, and he was a master printer because he spent years crafting that talent, working with David Vestal, who at the time was a former Photo League guru and a master printer himself. And Paul developed a friendship with David Vestal, and over a period of years they became close friends. And Paul way down there in Bainbridge, Georgia. So this is how Paul described where he's from. Decatur County is in the southwest corner of Georgia. Southern border joins Florida. Its western border is less than 30 miles from Alabama. Every day, 30,000 lives unfold. Men and women get up, they go to work, they return home, go to bed. Between rising and going to bed, they grow into their particularity. Life at the courthouse goes on simultaneously with life in factories. Prayer meetings overlap shopping. Sunday picnickers are clerks and teachers on Monday. Every citizen wears many hats, and all the while houses stand looking out on their streets and cemeteries silently wait. Paul was a great writer. He was a great thinker. And he took the medium of photography as seriously as anyone who has ever lived. He devoted his life to it. He became a master photographer. This is his book, the first one. You can still get this book. Any of you leaving here, if you're smart, go to Abe Books and you can find a few copies out there. Snag this thing. It's a guaranteed cult classic. It's a beautiful book. His second book came out a couple of years ago. I was just talking to Elizabeth about the show that traveled with it. My copy's sort of beat up and dog-eared. I've got another copy that I don't get off the shelf, but that's my working copy. But this book is more extensive than the first book in some ways, and Tom Rankin, who is up there in the pantheon of Southern curators, writers, thinkers, photographers, he's also at Duke, wrote a brilliant essay just filled with lots of insight into Paul's life and how his life in photography resulted in this very important document. This is a book I haul around with me so much that the covers almost come off. And I believe that this book is an almost perfect analog to the work that Paul did. If you don't know Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, you need to get to know it. In 1936, James Agee, a brilliant writer, and Walker Evans went to Hale County, Alabama on assignment with Fortune magazine. They spent 6 weeks living with tenant farmers. And they had an interesting sort of process similar to Paul's, except this document is so much better known. This is sort of an American classic. And the photographs in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men arguably are the most important collection of American photographs ever assembled. And I would say that Paul's work, this work would be like a motor scooter, and Paul's work would be like a tank. If that gives you, that's an analogy I feel pretty strongly about. Not that it's not brilliant work. Mr. Evans was a great photographer, but he was only down there 6 weeks. That wasn't his backyard. Paul had 40 years to do his work. These were his people. This was his place. This is a photograph, the first photograph when I first met Paul in I think it was 1990, 91, early 90s. Gail and I were on vacation somewhere in the Panhandle, probably Destin, and I just had to go meet him. And I called him, and he said, "Sure, come on up." At the time, he and his beautiful wife, Charlotte, they had one of the lovingest couples I've ever known. They were living on the Flint River at the time, beautiful live oaks and Spanish moss, and we just had a beautiful time with them. This is a courthouse. This is a jury room in Decatur County in Bainbridge. And I'm a lawyer. My day job is a lawyer, and I started out being a med-mal defense lawyer. And so I actually started as a prosecutor, so I had a lot of trial work. And so this was just so perfect for me. I could just feel the many juries have sat in this jury room and rendered various verdicts, innocent, guilty. People have been electrocuted from decisions made in that room. And somehow Paul captured a sort of a magical light, and then with his printing ability turned it into just a very important work of art. I can tell you at any given moment exactly where this photograph is. It's like my dog, my wife, my shotgun. There's some things you just know where they are at any given moment. I can't tell you probably where my car's parked, but I can tell you where this photograph is at any given moment. These are a couple of, again, the One Place book that I have with me, and I'm going to have time for questions, so if anybody, and afterwards we'll have time to be here, so if you want to look at the book. But these are a couple of things that Paul said that really resonated with me, that I can see in his images. A strong but tender image that speaks the truth. That's what Paul was often going for. And Paul believed, and I think you can see it in his photographs, and in most of his photographs, and you can certainly see it in when you spend time with Paul, he believed that feeling is one of the highest forms of knowing. And so whether it's that jury room we're looking at, or whether it's a photograph of a person or persons, like this image, you're given a moment with a person that you know that you're with that person. Paul was with that person. That person was with Paul. There's a never-ending kind of dialogue that goes on in a photograph like that, and there had to be a tremendous feeling that was being exchanged in that moment, and that's really hard to do. It's really hard to take a picture like that. I mean, there's so many different layers of things you have to know. You have to be able to get into that place, and then you have to know how to right when to take that picture, and you probably have to take that pictures like it 150 times before you get the one that you want. But Paul, because he was an outsider, I think he related to outsiders, because Paul was in some ways not like everybody else and somewhat invisible. Because of that, he sort of was able to identify with and connect with the people that he felt were kind of also maybe not seen, but Paul saw them, and I think they probably knew they were being seen. And there's so much dignity, and you just feel you're in the presence of fellow human beings when Paul is showing you the lives of these people that he's with. This is a picture that I put in. It's a really terrible reproduction, but I put it in to show those of you who are Walker Evans fans and know the work, American Photographs. This is a pretty early photograph, and Paul could take a picture that was an aesthetic beauty like nobody's business. He could make these just gems of formal beauty. And I got to see that print. Unfortunately, I ran out of money before I could. I would have bought. I would have put a third mortgage on my house if I could have, to have more Paul's pictures. But it's just an exquisite photograph that is such a thing of formal beauty. But Paul would tell you he wasn't going. There's nothing wrong with going for surface beauty and beautiful things, but that wasn't Paul's thing. If he had a picture that was also beautiful, great. But what he was wanting to do was connect with the subject and have that subject connect with his larger document about what he was trying to capture. Because he wasn't in it for he wasn't in it for a quick gallery show. He wasn't in it. I mean, he was in it. He was playing for keeps, and that comes across in every picture, and it comes across through all the pictures. It doesn't mean that his photographs weren't also often very beautiful as well as telling, but for Paul, they had to work first as a moment of truth of the human condition. And again, he was always out and about with his camera, or often out and about with his camera, but it wasn't just a walkabout. I mean, he kind of knew the areas that he was interested in exploring, and so he was ready when the people and the moments would appear. Great sense of humor. Paul had a tremendous joy about him. He could see the funny side of the human situation, but often even when there's humor, there's some tenderness or some other insight that goes along, like the boy kind of sticking his head that you don't see at first. He's got the skull on his shoulder, and it's just I guess it's the county fair in Decatur County, probably. I just felt right for the political season. I think if Donald Trump ever came through Bainbridge while Paul was down there, that would have been an interesting moment. But Paul didn't hesitate to show humans in their most silly moments. It's hard to tell which set of costumes is more odd, really.
Is that the guy in
I don't know. Paul just had a way of being with his people, and I'm sure a lot of these people. And I'll ask the Whaleys after the talk, but I don't think I ever asked Paul. Did he ever just really disappear, or did people still know it was eccentric Paul with his camera? I guess it was kind of a little both. But I love this picture because it just sort of, and I don't know who the gentleman is, it's all kind of prim and proper and looking, like he's ready for an inauguration, and then his fellow men there more maybe humble or down to earth, but Paul saw that and was able to capture that picture. Paul had access. The other thing that photographers know is you have to have great access to get great pictures, and Paul was, his family had been there since the 1860s when his grandfather came from Europe. And like a lot of the Jewish immigrants to the Deep South, developed a trade, was trading, and eventually became a hardware store. And Paul, grew up with all of the people, including the judges, so that it's very rare to get access to the courthouse. But Paul had access to the courtrooms, to every element of the courthouse, and captured amazing images inside the courthouse of people looking for justice, looking for freedom, looking for often going through difficult circumstances. I think of this one always as kind of a Madonna, a kind of an everyday, down and dirty Madonna with child. She's at the laundromat, but she's getting it done. Tom Rankin writes beautifully in the second book about, and I think Elizabeth was probably there for some of this, but after Paul passed away, I had the great pleasure of going with Paul to his office, which, as I recall, was in an old movie house. Is that right? Or it was an older building downtown, And by the time we were working on the film with Paul, he wasn't using the dark room there anymore, and I think it was just a place for him to go and think and ruminate and maybe make notes and write, think about things. But Tom noted many things that Paul had, quotes and things he had on his wall, and one of the ones that was on the wall was a quote by Richard Nelson: There may be more to learn by climbing the same mountain 100 times than by climbing 100 different mountains. And Paul believed deeply that if there was truth in the ability to observe human nature and the human condition, it could be done just as easily in Bainbridge, Georgia, or maybe more easily than by gallivanting around the world. And I think he certainly proved that. This is the old bridge that was torn down. He also has many, many photographs. He would return to the same themes again and again and working them and thinking about them differently. But this next quote gives you an idea of what it's like to have grown up in that community, to have had your grandfather, your father, your children, all of your whole life in that community. This is a story when he was 16, a woman committed suicide from that bridge we were just looking at. And every day walking home from school, I saw her rocking on her porch. She was snapping beads, reading the paper, just children going by. In her loose dresses and dowdy shoes, she looked harmless when men in the bateau dragged the river bottom after her suicide. I stood on the bank and watched, curious and ashamed of my curiosity. They said in 3 days the body would float, but it didn't. 2 boats went back and forth, pulling grappling hooks, a sight too gruesome to associate with the fleshy little woman on the porch. Days later, when they snagged her downstream, they had a hard time freeing her. I thought if she could have seen the trouble she was causing, she might not have jumped. That's so Paul. For weeks, I saw her corpse caught in that dark water along with her rocking. Until the bridge was torn down, I could locate the spot where she left her shoes when she jumped. Why would a woman about to drown herself take off her shoes? To me, that is just so Paul. He was fascinated by why do people do what they do. He had a tremendous curiosity about his own feelings, and he was always very conflicted, I think, about Bainbridge, about his people. He spoke sometimes about the love and the nurturing that he got in his community and what that gave him. It gave him the ability to be joyful and to see beautiful things. But he also talked about the wounds that he had received, as we all do, and how that played out in his work. So someone said, and Paul said that he agreed with this, that what Paul accomplished in his document was not a portrait of a place, Decatur County, Georgia, but it was a portrait of a man's relationship to a place. And if you spend a lot of time with these pictures, you begin to realize that this is really a portrait of Paul and all of his ambivalence, his love of, his knowledge of, his unresolved feelings about this place. One subject he returned to again and again was this beautiful cemetery statue, Sally Harris, is that the name of the statue? But Paul loved the cemetery, and it's one of the subjects where he would go back again and again, and generations of his family are buried in the Jewish section of this cemetery. And so he would photograph it. I don't know how many different, I've seen at least a dozen different ways that he photographs this angel. And we have one of the prints here in the show. You can look at it in a little bit. But this is one where after she had been cleaned up, which I never thought he thought it was a great idea to clean all that beautiful lichen and patina off of her, but she was broken, vandalized. But I put this here for the picture, but also for the quote, which is, I think, of all the things I've read that Paul said, describes best what he was doing. He says, I rearrange sacred furniture because my brain, not my camera, is my instrument. Beauty isn't enough. I'm looking at subject, not at the surface of the print, though I'm grateful when the surface turns out to be beautiful. And then this is with a great sense of humor. Great sense of humor. The statue just over the years she just kept having her issues. This one, when I first stumbled onto Paul's work, this one was one that grabbed my eye. This is kind of a showstopper. 100C flying saucers over Miami. Paul knew she would be there and probably photographed her many, many times, but he got just the right shot there. Paul was a Guggenheim Fellow, which for photographers, if you win or are awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship, that's like, I don't know, that's like you're a made person. That doesn't happen to a lot of great photographers, but it happened to Paul. And the story is told that when he got his letter receiving the Guggenheim Award, which would have been in the 80s, he went, and I don't know if this is his mother's grave or not, but probably not, but he went to his mother's grave and read the letter aloud. But that would be a Paul moment, because he was at the same time the most practical, down-to-earth person you can imagine, but also somewhat sentimental, I think, at heart. So that's pretty much what I wanted to tell you about Paul. I think it's a rare privilege for any photographer to get to really be brought inside the world of another photographer, particularly when it's someone that you respect as much as I respected Paul. And he was as generous with me as anyone I've ever known in the field. And he was a no-nonsense person who, over the course of many, many years, built arguably one of the great photographic documents of all time. And he rarely left. I mean, he did leave some, but I mean, he wasn't, I mean, his work was down there. So thank you for letting me tell you a little bit about my impressions of Mr. Kwilecki and the beauty of his work. And I'm ready for questions, if there's some questions. Yeah.
Family, is it, I'm sorry, is his daughter here?
Yeah, his daughter's here, yeah. And his grandson.
Very cool. So, what's it like, what was it like growing up with a dad that sounds like maybe he was a little eccentric and always had his camera with him? What were some of your experiences? Was that hard? Was it fun? Was it different?
Yes. It was.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Paul, Paul was a very complex man. Geniuses tend to be. He did not suffer fools lightly. He had some pretty direct opinions, and he didn't mind sharing them. But he could be, if he felt that you were authentic and genuine and had a real question, he could be the most loving person in the world. He adored his wife. When Gail and I would go at 5 o'clock, it was called Drinky Poo. And at 5 o'clock, the scotch would come out for him, and how'd she say it, Gail? Huh? Chardonnay. Chardonnay would come out for Charlotte. And she was just, and she adored Paul, and Paul worshiped her. And they were just, you hope that you and people you love can have a relationship like that. And they got each other. I mean, this is a man that gave up a business in, in the mid-70s? I mean, he gave up a thriving, flourishing hardware business. It was 3 generations in order to do his document. You got to be one hard-headed guy. Gail, if I'd told you in the mid-70s, when I still had kids, I was going to pursue photography, what would you have said, darling? But Charlotte, and in his book, when he writes about his accomplishment with Understandings, he makes it very clear that it was his and her work, because she was with him. So yeah. Great question. Yeah, Chip.
I've been curious to know how you get Kwilecki out of Kwilecki. Well, because it was Bill, I think, that told me I'd been mispronouncing the name. Now, it's been spelled differently, or is it a ethnic thing, or that's just the way you know?
Yeah, I always say Kwilecki, but it's Kwilecki. You pronounce the W? Kwilecki? Kwilecki. Oh, you don't pronounce another, yeah. Yeah. The last book had write-ups from the curator of San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, from our own Julian Cox wrote a nice piece about it. The work's just going to continue to it will continue to grow in importance over time. There's nothing else quite like it. There's Marvin Rogovin, who did mispronounced his name, but up in Milwaukee, I think, or somewhere up north, and focused on a lot of people. But it doesn't have neither, I don't think, the depth or the breadth or the devotion to excellence. And that's one of the other things. When the lights come back on, I hope you'll take a minute to just step into these prints and look at them, because they're like little magical gems. They're so finely wrought in the darkroom. Also, the film, Ruthie, is the film going to play tonight? Yeah, it'll play after. So you can hear Paul has he's so articulate, and he's got that southern brogue. I don't know, how did y'all avoid it? Did he send y'all to diction lessons so you wouldn't have? Paul's got, I can't imitate him, I wouldn't even try, but his voice is just so out of the deep south. And I guess I should also say, I should definitely say thanks to Mocha GA and to Chip. Chip did a beautiful job with the show, edge to edge, and was so smart to make Paul the cornerstone of it. And Ruthie Stein and Annette Cohn-Skelton and the team at Mocha GA have been so supportive. And so thank y'all. Thank you, Chip.